No problem.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. And thank you to Gay Gilbert and Susan Husband for the invitation to give this presentation this evening. To give an overview of all the species in Arizona is a pretty big task, and hopefully I can do it without eliminating too much. 45 minutes is not a lot to talk about it, and I hope the way I've put it together that you'll find interesting. I'm not really the person that should be giving this presentation. The late Ronald Coleman, friend and colleague for too short period of time, in my view. I've known him since 2014. Ron was a kind, smart, and passionate man whose training was and profession was in engineering, but as a hobby, he was a fanatic about orchids, so much so that he wrote 2 books about them. The Wild Orchids of Arizona and New Mexico, which came out in 2002, and the Wild Orchids of California in 1995. So an overview of the family is there's not a lot of consensus on how many species there are. So anywhere between 25,000 and 35,000 species, and greater than 750 genera. It's the largest family of flowering plants, but some people say that Asteraceae might be. It's pretty hard to say which is the most species rich when you're dealing with that many taxa. And the lineage is fairly old and greater than 76 million years of age, and it could be as old as over 100 million years old. The family has a worldwide distribution, but as we probably already know, the highest diversity is in the tropics. Interesting tidbit is that about 30% of the species have no floral reward for potential pollinators, and these deceptive species tend to have low visitation and fruit set. So it's offers evolutionary biologists a lot of questions to test. And no doubt everybody knows that Darwin wrote a whole book on orchids and their insect pollinators. So, you know, when you have a whole book dedicated to you by Darwin, you're pretty important family of plants. So before I get into the Arizona orchids, and rather than showing you the epiphytic orchids in the cloud forests of Ecuador or in the Amazon basin, I will just give a couple of examples of some of the diversity that most people aren't aware of. And one is the genus Rhizanthella from Australia, has 4 species. And this is the only plant species that lives its entire life underground. And they do not photosynthesize. They are fully parasitic. They derive all their nutrition from fungal hosts. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. But that plate shows you an example of the plants, and they're very small, and most of them are critically endangered. How do you survey for a plant like that without digging them all up? That's the thing. Most of the when the plants flower, they flower right below the surface, and they're probably pollinated by flies that dig down, brought by the smell. But the flowers never really get above ground or above the duff on the ground. So super fascinating. And then there are some of the smallest plants in the world, a couple of genera in Orchidaceae. So here's an example of Platystele that you can see by the scale bar on the right. Those little demarcations are millimeters. So the flowers are so thin that they're actually translucent, just a couple millimeters, or if that, wide and long. And the total size of the plant you can see at the end of the fingertip there, that grows on another orchid root. So I had never seen those plants before, and I just threw that in out of interest. So one of the most important things besides the pollination syndromes of the orchids and their interactions with insects and other animals is that all orchids are reliant on fungi to some point at some point in their life. And there are a couple of terms that we need to talk about first. One is autotrophic. So that is where most plants, where they photosynthesize and get nutrition, fix carbon from the sun and carbon dioxide, and get minerals from the soil. Well, mycoheterotrophic, which a lot of orchids are, and it's where all or part of the nourishment is from another fungal partner. So, this second. And then there's mixoheterotrophic. Mixotrophic, where the plant is photosynthetic, but also partially dependent on a fungal partner. And the orchids have both mycoheterotrophic fully, partially, and mixotrophic. As far as I know, there are no fully autotrophic orchids unless they are in culture. There are 5 types of mycorrhizal associations in plants, and the orchids have a special one that's called the Orchid Mycorrhizae, and it's seen in the bottom right-hand quadrant there. And oops, go back here, where the fungi go into the root cells and actually make a structure called a coiled hyphae called pelotons. And that's where the transfer of nutrients goes from the fungi to the plants. It's not known if some of the orchids provide any nutrients to the fungi. There's a lot of work of research that can be done on this. So orchid seeds, one of the, most people know, the seeds are minute, and the left photo shows orchid seeds with just an embryo and no endosperm, and that's a characteristic of the seeds for the family. So that embryo is reliant on outside nutrition to get going. And the photo on the right shows orchid seeds in comparing to a grape seed. So the grape seed's about 1 millimeter or so. And those little, so the seed is very like dust-like. So to get started in life out in the wild, orchids need an association. The orchid seeds need an association with a fungal symbiont. And some of these symbiotic relationships are very tight, and others, some orchid species can use many different fungal symbionts. And one way you test that is you can see a plate with one inoculation from a fungal strain, and then each asterisk was a different species of orchid seed placed onto the quadrant there. And only one species, the one with the arrow, germinated and grew to the seedling stage. The rest failed to germinate with that fungal inoculum. This figure shows the orchid species on the left-hand column with the photos, and the fungal source on the right-hand column. And there are 3 orders of fungal symbionts, fungal symbionts on the right. And some orchids can use multiple species or lineages of even different orders of the fungi, where others, like the 2 on the top, Callidania and Petrostylus, those can only use the fungi that are isolated from their own roots or from their species roots. And the dot and the solid lines are where they can complete their life cycle or grow to maturity using that fungus. And the dotted lines are where the seeds might germinate, but they will abort at some point. And so that's not a true symbiotic relationship. I hope everyone's familiar with SciNet. So within SciNet, if you want to check out the species of orchids in the state, you can go to Arizona Flora, and then you can see the search option on the right side of the screen there and type in Orchidaceae, and it will bring up the list that I've put together. There are 27 species and 13 genera within the state and 28 taxa. For the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to talk about the varieties of orchids. That just keeps it simple. So as I was putting this talk together, it was interesting to find that 5 species have been described in the last 35 years, which is pretty interesting to me for such a popular group like orchids. But hundreds of orchids or thousands are described every year in the tropics. So starting in 1986, Platanthera zothecina was described, Spiranthes delitescens, which I'll talk about in detail later, 1990, Shidiel Arizonica in 2000. That has an interesting story in that it's been known for in the state for over 100 years. It was collected, I think, first in the Pinaleño mountains in the 1880s. And in Kearney and Peebles, it was treated as Spiranthes parasitica. Well, in 2000, Paul Brown noticed that that the species that occurs in Arizona was definitely not Spiranthes parasitica, and you could find no other place to put the species, so it had to be described as something new. So it had been known for a long time, described in Kearney and Peebles, incorrectly, and then described as a new species. And then Hexaelectrus Colemanii, that was named in honor of Ron Coleman in 2004. And then Platanthera toscanus, 2006, that's an intermountain orchid. It goes from California, Nevada, Utah, all the way to Colorado. And it's only known from, as far as I know, one population in Navajo County. So if you plot the diversity of the orchids per the counties, you find that Apache, Cochise, and Coconino, and Greenlee have the most species, and which is kind of interesting because Greenlee is such a small county that it has nearly as much as the much larger counties. Now, you look at the counties like La Paz, Maricopa, Mojave, and Pinal, they only have one species of orchid, that would be Epipactus Gigantea, which occurs at lower elevations. And poor Yuma has no, its Epipactus has not been found so far in Yuma County, but it should be looked for at Seep Springs and along streams, even along the Colorado River. If you plot the number of orchids, the number of species per the elevation in the state, you see that Epipactus Gigantea dominates the low elevations, but the real diversity is between 7,000 and 10,000 feet. So that's up in the mountains. And at 10,000 feet, there's barely any habitat. So that explains why the diversity sharply drops off. So most of the diversity is 5,000 to say 10,000, with the highest diversity at 7,000 feet. I know this slide is a little confusing here, but I've plotted the species on the left, the column, and the second from the left is the elevation at which species occurs. And the ones in the red, which I've circled or put marks next to, are the rarer orchids for the state. One thing to notice, like the ones I've circled, is that they have a very narrow elevational range, and that's they're very specific to their habitat, which explains their rarity. At the top of the list with the star, Cipropydium Parvithlorum, although it has a big range of elevations, and I've never seen that in the wild, but talking to Ron Coleman, he was saying that some of the populations have been extirpated, and probably by collectors who go up and dig them up and think that they can either take them to their garden or sell them. So that species really should be monitored, because it, as I'll show a picture of Cipropydium later, it's a beautiful orchid, and please, if you see orchids, do not pick them up and try to grow them in your yard because a lot of them are rare. And at the bottom of the screen, on the left-hand side of Spiranthes delitescens, I put a little E next to it. It is endangered, and that has a very narrow range, and that's one of the lower elevation orchids in the state. Again, the same list of the orchids for the state is on the left, and the ones in blue are the ones that are found in mesic to wet habitats, and 57% of the orchids in Arizona are found in wet to mesic habitats. So that's important for conservation purposes because with groundwater decline and other modifications to the watersheds around the state, that a lot of the orchids could be in trouble. There are about 200 chlorophyllous orchids in the world, and Arizona has 7 of those species. So 26% of those species in Arizona do not have chlorophyll, and they are fully mycoheterotrophic. That is, they're fully reliant on the mycorrhizae mycorrhiza fungus for their nutrition. And interestingly too, because they do not photosynthesize, they're also leafless. So we have 3 species of Corallarhiza that and Hexaelectrus that are the achlorophyllous species. So I'll start with the achlorophyllous species. So we have Corallarhiza maculata, and I'll try not to talk too much to some of these slides because I just think if you concentrate on the beauty of some of these orchids some of them are rarely seen. Some like Corallarhiza maculata are fairly common, but I've never seen many of them before until I really started looking for them. Sometimes you find them growing in clumps like this, and that's because they are rhizomatous. So they're probably 1 or 2 individuals giving rise to multiple stems. And you can see there are no leaves, and there's a lot of color variation within them. And there are even some color morphs where they're whitish or yellowish or deep purple or yellow or red. So one of Tucson's own, James Verrier, wrote a paper in Desert Plants that you can all look up online, and it talks about the habitat preferences of these 3 orchids, Corallarhiza, that occur in Arizona, and he did his work up on top of Mount Lemmon, and I'll refer to some of his findings. So for Corallarhiza maculata, he looked at the preferences for the trees with which they grow with it, associated with. Now, a lot of the trees are associated with different fungi. So it could be that the fungi of the different trees are different species depending on the tree. This would be interesting to test. So, or it just could be chemistry of the soil. I don't know if that's known just right now. But Corallarhiza maculata is usually associated with Pinus stripiformis and Abies concolor. And Corallarhiza striata, as you can see the little colony on the bottom left-hand picture, there's a maple leaves on the ground there, is associated with Abies concolor and Acer grandidentatum, the maple. And Corallarhiza wisteriana here. You can see the plant on the left. And that's a coralloid rhizome that you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen that I pulled up. And you can see at the base there's branching in the rhizome. So that was probably going to another plant or another stem from the same rhizome. And Corallarhiza wisteriana is associated with Abies concolor and Pseudotsuga menziesii most often. So that was a great study. And James did another paper, published another paper in the same issue, where he studied the population of Corallorhiza striata and the precipitation. He tracked it through 9 years. And what he found is that the number of stems closely, for the most part, tracked the precipitation. And during drought periods, the number of stems dropped significantly and then bounced back once precipitation returned to normal. So there's a really tight correlation between water, moisture, and these orchids. Here's another example of a non-photosynthetic orchid, Hexaelectrus Arizonica. You can see that the pink stem on the left, it just looks like an alien being if you didn't know what it was, just a stick with flowers. Hexaelectrus Arizonica, sometimes the flowers don't open and they potentially could self-pollinate. Janet Fox published an article in the plant press. So all of you, if you're interested, you can check it out in the 2000, what is that? I can't see right here because of the screen. The winter 2019 issue of the plant press. And she dedicated the article to Ron Coleman, which was really nice. And this is a nice photo of Hexalectrus Colmanii. It differs from Arizonica in that the petals are reflex. And if you can take a look at the lip, it's got a nice purple lip there. Beautiful. I'm going to keep plugging the plant press here. The winter 2016, Eric Wallace and Teague Emery tried to find out what was pollinating Hexalectrus Colmanii, and they spent a lot of time to try to figure out what was doing it. And they, as far as I understand, didn't find anything that was pollinating it during their study. But they did find some of the plants with capsules on them, but they never saw what pollinated those plants. And the last species is Hexalectrus Parvoflora, and Parvi is purple, and you could see the purple lip there. Oh, one more species, and this is spectacular, Hexalectrus Warnockii. It's only known from one place in Arizona, down in the Chiricahua Mountains. I can see why people just get hooked on photographing orchids. Now, going to the orchids that photosynthesize, there's Calypso Bulbosa. And what's interesting here is if you look at the photo in the left, this orchid only has one leaf at maturity. That's it, just one leaf, and it sends up that beautiful inflorescence. And there's only one flower per plant. A nice shot on it, just gorgeous. When we look at the distribution of some of these orchids, Arizona is kind of at the crossroads of a lot of things, and you see a lot of common patterns. And one is in Calypso Bulbosa is that it's near the southern range of the species distribution. And another common pattern is that the up along the orchid populations follow the Mogollon rim, and the Calypso Bulbosa can be found up by Flagstaff all the way down into New Mexico. Cipropydium Parvithlorum is one of the largest orchids in the state, and it's a pretty widespread distribution. The left shows the habitat, and oh, I should go back to the Calypso and note that we have two orchids, that have this inflated or slipper-like lip, and Calypso bulbosa is one of those where that lower lip is inflated, and Cipropydium Parvithlorum is super inflated. And Cipropydium, if you're interested in pollination studies, that has a lot of people have studied the pollination syndrome in there, and that's a cheat. It gets it lures the insects into that inflated lip, and they only have one passageway out in which they gather the anther brush past the anther in order to get out of the flower. After a few times of doing that with no reward, the insects apparently learn and then avoid pollinating the plant or visiting the plant. And again, a similar kind of distribution for Cipropydium Parviflorum in the state. It's found along the Mogollon Rim, and it's the southwestern most distribution for that. So we have those two species are their southern distribution is in the state. In contrast, Dichromathis Michoacanus is found in the southern part of the state, and it's found in oak, juniper, woodland. And this is the latest blooming orchid in the state. It blooms from September to October. And I don't know if you can see it. It's really cryptic when it flowers, because the grass is usually dead by then, and it's leafless when it flowers. Most of the time, the leaves have died and turned brown. And the way you normally find the orchid, probably not when it's flowering, because it's just, they're really cryptic, but it's during the July through September when the leaves are green and long and fleshy. Beautiful flower striped with the green in it, and very hairy on the outside. When I was visiting a population down by the Huachuca Mountains, I noticed I found around eight separate populations, or small populations like these, and there were 4 of them that had katydids on them, and the katydids were eating the flowers, but not only the petals, but they were also eating parts of the ovary. So insect herbivory could potentially reduce the seed set in several of orchids that I've heard of. And here's an example of this Dichromathis, even though very rare, but those katydids found it, and we're making a meal out of it. So Dichromathis Michoacanus in Arizona is known from the Catalina Mountains, the Huachuca Mountains, and down by Parker Canyon Lake down south. And most of its distribution is in Mexico. So in contrast to the previous orchids, this is the northern range of a more tropical or Mesoamerican orchid. Epipactus Gigantea is the most widely distributed orchid in the state, and it's found from low elevations to about 7,000 feet. And normally when you find it, you find more than one individual. You can find hundreds in certain places. It grows along, it's always associated with seeps, springs, or streams, or small creeks. So no doubt that its range has been reduced because of groundwater pumping and damming and other water diversion. Goodyear Oblongafolia. There are 2 species in Arizona, Goodyear repens, but I won't show a photo of that. And they have a basal rosette of like 3 to 5 leaves, and usually those leaves have, you can see on the left-hand side, have a whitish midvein. And both species have white flowers. We have 4 species of Malaxis in the state, and most of the time they occur in wet meadows, and like this meadow. And again, the health of the forest, if the forest is not healthy, then the meadow would be encroached by woody vegetation, and also really dense vegetation will kind of suck the water out of the meadow. So the lack of natural forest fires might be reducing the habitat for a lot of higher elevation orchids. Malaxis abeticola has a racemose inflorescence, and it's easily, when these species of Malaxis are flowering, they're easy to tell apart, but they all only have one leaf at maturity, and that leaf is clasped the stem. The leaves, I don't know of a way to differentiate the 4 species by vegetative means, but with the inflorescence, it's really easy. Here's another distribution where the Arizona is at the western edge and the northwestern part of the distribution. Malaxis Corombosa, you can see on the left, the inflorescence is corombose. Again, on the left-hand side, there's just one leaf. And those flowers are about 4 to 5 millimeters long. So it's tiny little flowers and semi-translucent as well. One of my favorite orchids in the state is Malaxis Porphyria. You can see the purplish color to the petals. And again, only one leaf, and it shoots up. This can have a really long flowering stalk for the size of the leaf. Really striking when you see it. Here's a shot of Ron Coleman taking a look at Malaxis Sulii. That inflorescence is spicate, and the flowers are just depressed to the rachis. And you can see multiple plants in that shot, and some are small and lack an inflorescence, and others have a nice long inflorescence. Niadia Con Valoroides is fairly rare. It occurs at higher elevations, and it has this really like flipper-like lip, and the rest of the sepals and petals are pulled backwards. We have 5 species of Platanthera in the state, and they're all associated with seep springs or streams. I'll only show one photo here, one species, and this is Platanthera limosa. It can be found up on top of Mount Lemon. And you can see the lemon colored lip there on the flowers on the right. And interestingly, the other 2 petals form kind of like a hood above the column. A strange species is Shidiel Arizonica. On the left, you can see the plant in flower and the bulbous rhizome on the at the bottom there. And interestingly, that just grows right at the interface of the soil and the pine duff. And this plant doesn't flower, doesn't have leaf when it flowers. It flowers from May through June, and then it will flower from July. Then it will leaf out in July through the rest of the monsoon season. So when you're searching for it, this plant only grows about 15 centimeters to 20 centimeters tall. It's just this little stick out of the pine duff with small 5 millimeter white flowers, not very showy and really hard to see. You can be standing right above it and not see it. So, and this is what it's like when it's leafed out. Just 2, sometimes 3 leaves, and that's it. So it can be confused for seedlings from a bunch of other plants. So it's probably really under-collected, and it has a much wider distribution. Here is the pattern that we've seen before, and that the population in Arizona is at the western edge. It occurs in New Mexico and very western Texas. It should be looked for in both northern Sonora and Chihuahua because the habitat's really similar to what occurs in Arizona. And we have 2 species of Spiranthes in Arizona, Spiranthes romanzoffiana, and the one I'll talk about is Spiranthes delitescens, and that's in the blue circles just below Tucson on the map. And here's another pattern where Spiranthes romanzophiana is at its southern distribution, and Spiranthes delitescens is endemic to the state of Arizona. And it's only known from 5 localities and all cienega or wetland habitat. So here's a photo of Spiranthes delitescens on the left. Beautiful flowers. It grows. It's really cryptic when it's not flowering. As you can see on the right, that's my colleague Steve Blackwell from Desert Botanical Garden, right next to the flowering of one flowering plant. And without flower, it's nearly impossible to find. That's my finger there on the right-hand side of the screen, right next to a stem going straight up. And you can see tucked in with that other grassy or wetland vegetation, it's impossible to differentiate from other monocots there. Can you spot the Spiranthes in this photo? There's my field book to the on the bottom of the screen. I'll move my cursor. See that the yellow flower here, the ranunculus. If you go straight across, right in the center of the screen is one Spiranthes flower individual. So part of our conservation efforts is that we are trying to get populations of all the orchids in the state. And I will talk about our collaboration with the North American Orchid Conservation Center. And we're also trying to get the fungal symbionts associated with each orchid. So what we're doing is we're collecting when we can, and the orchid roots and sending them to the Smithsonian for them to extract the pelotons from the roots and try to culture the associated fungal symbiont. The plants on the left here are in fruit, and the packet in the right, if you can see the dark area at the bottom of the packet, those are the minute seeds. So there are thousands of seeds in that little packet. So we will seed bank those, and we're also going to try to, the Smithsonian has isolated several of the plants that we've sent them. So now we have in culture the fungal symbiont and the seeds. So hopefully we can propagate in ex situ the plants with their proper symbiont, and hopefully pollinate them in culture and increase the amount of seed that we have. Again, another plug for the Native Plant Society Winter 2016 issue with Aaron Hicks talks about growing the Spiranthes delitescens in culture. So there are some threats going along with, and this is part of my research interests and conservation interests, is that Spiranthes delitescens has not been found at one of the sites for over 20 years. The chart at the bottom shows the number of plants on the left and the years on the bottom. And orchid populations are known to fluctuate wildly. And so this is no surprise that the population goes up and down. The years where there are no bars, where there were no surveys, but you can see from 2010 to 2016, when we submitted this report, we did not find the orchid, and I've had surveyed every year since 2016, and the orchid has not been found at O'Donnell Cienega, nor at a location, one other location downstream from the O'Donnell Cienega. So right now, it's currently only known from 3 localities. This year we did a survey and we found roughly 16 at one population, 85 in another. So the whole population, only 100 flowers. We don't know how many are vegetative in each population. Sometimes orchids can stay dormant and reliant on their symbiotic fungi to stay kind of quiescent for years and years. And then when the right environmental condition will come up, they'll send up their stalks and flower. So we don't know what's going on, but it's kind of troubling that no orchid has been seen at O'Donnell for over 20 years. So this is upstream from O'Donnell Cienega, and this is one of the threats, the large threat that's for Cienegas, not just in Arizona, but the Southwest in general, is erosion and a groundwater decline. So you can see right in the middle of the screen, that's a big erosive gully that chomped through that land about 20 years ago. At the Canelo Hills Cienega Preserve, there has also been a massive erosion event, which this head cut is about 10 feet deep, and it's lowered the water table. If you look in the background too, you can see the Cienega, there's alligator juniper, Juniperus depiana, invading the habitat. And so historically, the Cienegas were much more open, and the best habitat is that has some form of disturbance, be it fire or maybe even grazing. And this habitat hasn't had any disturbance in a long time. At the property boundary, you can see things that have been done like 80 years ago, like this canal. There used to be, at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a road that was on the right-hand side of this fence. So the water flows from the left-hand side towards the right-hand side downstream. In order to dry out the road, they created a canal and put the water through a culvert. And so what that has done is it's dried out the Cienega downstream from the canal. So with funds from Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, I've got, and in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, we started to do some restoration work in order to improve water quality and improve the wetland habitat. Wetlands filter the water and increase water quality. DEQ was concerned about the amount of E. coli going into the San Pedro, and the O'Donnell Creek is a tributary to the Baba Kamari, which then goes into the San Pedro. So by improving the water quality upstream in the tributaries, we can hopefully improve the water quality downstream of the San Pedro. So what we did was that canal that you see right here is I had Stream Dynamics, Val Van Clothier from Stream Dynamics in Silver City, Mexico, come out and do some restoration work. He breached that, he plugged the canal, and we spread the water across the wetland once again. And then he made certain features to slow down and trap the water. And by increasing the residence time, you increase the infiltration and decrease the E. coli load on it. And we also had money to remove juniper. So we removed a lot of juniper, and that's still TNC is still removing juniper from that property. Speaking in the Nature Conservancy, this is right from their website. So the Nature Conservancy website, Arizona, Stories in Arizona, Restoring Arizona Forests. And if you can see at the top here that healthy forests are essential for abundant and clean water. And then at the bottom, unfortunately, our forests are overcrowded and unhealthy. And we've seen a lot of catastrophic fires. Catastrophic fires in Arizona. So it's nice that if we improve the health of those forests, we'll improve the increase the amount of water available to the orchids and increase the habitat. So orchid conservation requires a lot of different people working together. So people that study the mycorrhiza, pollination, seed germination, living collections, germplasm restoration, all towards the goal of species recovery. And of the more than 200 orchid species in the US and Canada, greater than 50% are vulnerable, threatened, endangered, or extinct. And with that in mind, Dr. Dennis Wingham at the Smithsonian Institution started a collaboration with the US Botanic Garden to create the North American Orchid Conservation Center. And their mission is to ensure the survival of all the native orchids in the US and Canada. So as an example of what's going on, the plate on the left shows the distribution of Corallarhiza trifida in the 1850s, and then slowly population decreasing. At the bottom right of that panel, you can see it's only known from a few populations in New York. So that's quite a decrease, and that's unfortunately a reoccurring story for the orchids. So the goals of the NAIOC is to have fungal banks to conserve the genetic diversity of fungi that interact with the orchids, and not only just to conserve it, but to study and understand that diversity. Create seed banks to conserve the genetic diversity of the orchids and to propagate them too. So establish sustainable populations, both in botanic gardens and then to reintroduce them as well. And the fourth goal is to educate the public about orchid conservation and engage people into hands-on conservation. And here's a broken record about the winter 2016 version of the Plant Press, but Dennis wrote an article outlining the story of NAIOC in that issue as well too. So if you care, download it and give it a read. So NAIOC is a collaboration with a lot of partners, and Desert Botanical Garden is a partner of the Southwest, along with Borderlands Restoration down in Patagonia. So we've been working in Arizona, and this year we went up to Nevada, and hopefully we'll be working in New Mexico as well. So I've told you about some of the orchids that we've collected. We've collected seeds from quite a few and fungi from a bunch too, but we still have a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers for you or any slides to show you of what we've done so far. But I can tell you we're making great progress, and we could always use people. I could always use information from anybody out there that has an orchid population that they know about and could share with me that I could potentially visit and collect from. So if you haven't, please check out the North American Orchid Conservation website. It's got some great videos and great resources on there. And there's a really great website that you can find attached to that, the NAIOC website. It's called Go Orchids, and that has a lot. If you look on the bottom, you could find orchids by location. You could put in your state and hit the search button, the orchid by name, or you can use a simple key to key out orchids. And they have lots of good photos and information about each orchid. So I think my time is close to being up, and I just want to thank Ron and Jan, a lot of people, Ron and Jan Coleman, the late Ron Coleman, Erie Payak, Elliot Hendricks, Frank Rose, Wendy Hodgson, Steve Blackwell, private landholders, Jim Coweek, Dennis Wingham, and DBG, Nature Conservancy, and Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Hopefully I didn't go over time.
Thank you, Andrew. That was just fascinating. And yeah, I feel like for my own knowledge, we've just scratched the surface. So it's really amazing. We do have a couple questions. Let's see here. And one that I've thought about before too, it's so the orchid plants that we buy in the grocery stores, those have a fungal component with them as well?
They probably don't. So you can, some species, at least the ones that you can easily find in the horticultural trade, they're started on nutrient media. So that they don't have the fungal component to them. You can germinate some and get seeds to develop on nutrient medium. And then once it's fully autotrophic, once it develops photosynthetic tissues, then it can become autotrophic.
Oh, okay. So, but
Yeah,
those
so
are,
each orchid is different on their reliance on the fungal symbiont. So some need them their entire life, like the achlorophyllus ones, and others, even though they're photosynthetic, different stages of their life cycle, depending on the stress, they may or may not need the symbiont.
okay. And then Doug Ripley put in a message. Wonderful talk, Andrew. Thank you. Perhaps you could say a little more about Hexaelectrus Parviflora. The first collection of this species in the United States was discovered by Janet Fox in the Dragoon Mountains. Then he goes on to say, and collected by Reuben Gay, Douglas Ranger District biologist.
Yeah, that I wish I could tell you more about that. Janet is the expert on that. A lot of those Hexalectrus are so rare that I've only seen Warnockiae. Again, unfortunately, I'm not the expert on a lot of these orchids. I'm doing it because there's a need, and we have this collaboration going, and I'm already interested in conserving wetlands in Arizona. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, we might have to have some more orchid programs. Then someone has put in the link in the chat for back issues of the Plant Press, which are on the Native Plant website. Let's see.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the quality of the plant press that I cited it so many times. It's really a great resource.
It is. Oh, and then here it says, do you know the story about a rare Hexalectrus was an obstacle to the Rosemont mine? So the mine managers hired botanists to look for more plants around the state. They found more populations and reduced the rarity status of the orchid.
Right. Yeah, they put a lot of effort into those surveys, and it's great that they found additional populations. But those Hexalectrus they're just not common.
It's I love the name. What does it mean? Do you know?
Well, I think it's referring to the lamellae on the lip, and unfortunately, I think that is a misnomer, because instead of having 6 lamellae, I forgot it has 5 or 7. So, yeah.
It just sounds good. It sounds like a name of a superhero.
Yeah.
A woman superhero.
Yeah.
And then a lot of praise and compliments. Great talk, good talk. So you can look at these, as we finish up. Oh, then are there mounted specimens at well, 2 questions about the Desert Botanical Gardens. Are there mounted specimens in the herbarium there, and what orchids are cultivated at Desert Botanical Garden?
Well, we are we just got the Mycorrhizae for Spiranthes delitescens isolated this summer. So that's at the Smithsonian right now, and we have the seed, so we can start that. But we might try tissue culturing the Spiranthes here as well too. So right now we don't have anything going, because Spiranthes is really the one that we're focusing on. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to get the fungal symbiont to do that. So yeah, we do have orchid vouchers in the herbarium, but we don't have anything growing right now in horticulture.
Susan, you skipped my message.
Well,
it says, I have a question in turn. I wanted to ask if anybody's doing DNA sequencing on the species. Can Andrew answer that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of studies for the DNA, and I can't tell you the number, which species have or have not, but I think a lot of them have. So I know Corallarhiza, Hexaelectrus, a lot of the Spiranthes have. I don't think Shidiel has been done, but Dichromathis has. Yeah, there are a lot of species to go through, but
Okay,
I think a
thank
lot
you.
of them have been sequenced.
Oh, yeah, I apologize that I.
No problem, Susan,
that.
understandable.
But there's another question here too about genetic diversity. It's troubling that these populations are often so small and likely have little genetic diversity. Has anyone looked at genetic variation in some of these species? Especially with the pollination by pollenia, the seeds within a capsule are all genetically full sibs, which reduces the variation.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody who's done a population genetic study for the orchids in Arizona. Yeah, I'm sure it's been done in other states, but not for Arizona.
There's another
That
great
definitely would be
project.
Interesting.
Another great student project.
That yeah, I mean that's a characteristic of a lot of orchids, that they're just rare and they've got these weird pollination syndromes, and some years they're up and some years they're dormant, and yeah, they're just a tricky group, but that's what I think what makes them so special.
Okay, and I guess if anyone else has a question, if you would like to unmute and ask your.
I see one from Jillian, propagated through meristem culture. I don't think I'm unaware if anybody's tried that. Aaron Hicks would be the person to ask that question to, about the that culture stuff. I don't do any of that propagation, so.
Oh, you're right. Has this been tried with any orchids?
It seems like, given the way that the populations can vary in size so dramatically between different years, that orchids have evolved on a timeline that doesn't fit very well with our attempts to conserve it. It's very frustrating, I'm sure.
Yeah, and the thing too is some of them are so ephemeral that you really have to be there at the right time. If you show up too early to survey for Spiranthes delitescens, there's no way you're going to find it. And if you show up too late, it's almost the same thing. I mean, it's a little easier to see once they're in fruit, but they just blend into the background so well.
I guess we can hope that maybe that means that there are more out there than we actually know about, but especially for those that are so dependent on cienagas that are so easily damaged hydrologically, that's a hard sell as a whole. So,
Andrew, I was wondering, have you guys pinned down the pollinators for the spring coral root? I by chance photographed a little syrphid fly with what I'm sure was pollinia from spring coral root on it, but I didn't actually see one transferring pollinia to a flower.
Really? No, I've never done any studies, any pollination studies. A few times when I've been at orchids, Spiranthes, infernalis in Nevada, and delitescens, I've seen some bees. Unfortunately, I didn't get a photo of them, visit them.
Oh.
But yeah, I'm not a pollination biologist, so.
Oh, you need to get somebody that'll hang out there and get the photos of the.
Yeah, super interesting.
Try to get a photo, actually document pollinia attached to an insect and then getting, transferred to a flower,
right.
or, disappearing when the insect comes out from a flower,
Yeah.
I mean, that chance photo of a little syrphid fly with the pollinia on its back, that was purely, I didn't even realize it had it until I got the photo home and got it up on the screen, and I was like, what the heck is that on its
Oh my
thorax, and there was this beautiful maroon pollinia. It's like, that's gotta be spring coral root, there's
Wow.
nothing else with a maroon pollinia,
Wow,
there
if
at
it
that time.
detached it might well be. That's it's interesting.
So,
If you have that photo you wouldn't mind sharing with me, I'd appreciate it.
yeah, I could easily do that. If you, I'll try to get your email from Irene.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's those cameras for the big mammals, the bobcats and the mountain lions and so forth. They're rather large, but they're widely used. There should be a miniature one you can set up right on an orchid and just let it sit there for a few days. I don't even know, is that on the market? Has anybody done that? I would think so.
Yeah, they're a little more pricey than a wildlife camera though.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. And as soon as you get into macro, your depth of focus starts diminishing fast. So that's the problem, is that big scale stuff, your depth of focus tends to be pretty generous. And as you get into more and more macro, it diminishes. So to be focused exactly on the right spot, it's tough,
So we do have 2 more questions, and then we probably should finish up. Were orchids more widespread during interglacials? And are we now seeing more relic populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I could answer it, but it seems that probably Spiranthes delitescens is a branch off some way from Spiranthes romanzophiana, perhaps when times were cooler. But yeah, that's I don't know how we'd test that right now. But yeah, interesting question. And definitely you can see a lot of interglacial and glacial characteristics of some of those orchids the further north you go. And the other question, are Ron Coleman's books still in print? Yes, they are. You can get them on Amazon.
Oh, great.
And I recommend them. They're not too technical. They're perfect for the enthusiasts and perfect for the professional as well. So they're really good books.
That's great.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure you were going to say the same thing. Sorry, Susie.
No, that's okay. I think we're all thinking thank you and grateful to that you've shared your knowledge with us and your photographs, beautiful photographs.
Yeah, I relied on a lot of other people for those.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's especially nice to sort of put it in a larger context and talk a little bit about the family as well as the local or the areas that we have. So it was a great survey. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you to all of our audience for joining us. And we'll have another great talk next month. So please watch for the e-blast. Check our webpage if you don't get the e-blast for our updates. And we'll see you next month. Okay?
Thank you. Okay.
All right.
Bye, everybody.